Okay, hello everyone. My name is Cora Stewart, and my presentation is on the integration of baseball. So let's get started. So from my first primary source is called Nowhere So Sharply Drawn as in Baseball. And this article was about how society and baseball were kind of related. So at this time in history, which was about the 1940s, 1950s, baseball kind of stood for, or I guess a better way to say it is represented how society dealt with segregation and discrimination of people of color, and that also unfortunately took place in baseball. So in this article, it compared the two directly and actually made it seem like the segregation and discrimination against people of color was worse in baseball than it was in society. The direct quote is, "In no other business in America is the color line so finely drawn as in baseball." So this article really emphasized that it was much worse in baseball than it was in society, which may sound like a slight exaggeration, but it could be pretty accurate, as baseball, was a representation of society. So um, it was how people used to have fun back in the day. They didn't have internet like we did. Players of color in the past had tried to join a white team. It never worked out for them. They were often injured and ridiculed, and it was said that a player of color who tried to play baseball on a white team was considered taking his life in his hands. And that really emphasized the danger that anybody of color who tried to join a white team was in, because not only did they face the insults and the scrutiny, but they faced violence and getting injured on purpose, which was dangerous for them. My second primary source, Branch Rickey, discusses Jackie Robinson. Branch Rickey referred to Jackie Robinson through this article as a noble experiment. He decided that he was going to choose a player of color to join the white major leagues team, and whoever he chose had to be an exceptional player. It couldn't just be someone that was average, because then they would get even more insulted. But it also had to be somebody who was smart. He wanted a man of exceptional intelligence, a man who was able to grasp and control the responsibilities of himself to his race and could carry that load. So what that means is that he wanted somebody who could represent their race in baseball to the public, and face the insults and the possible violence, and be able to stand up for themselves and not lose their temper over it. So Jackie Robinson was chosen, and he became a representation of his race. In the first researched source, Breaking the Color Line, 1940 to 1946, it was said that Branch Rickey actually referred to Jackie Robinson as a great experiment, which contradicts the previous article where he referred to him as a noble experiment. Branch Rickey had plans to integrate the races all along. That's what was hinted in the article, is that it was some sort of master plan that he kept to himself, to avoid the insults, and he knew that whoever he chose to be integrated was still going to face that. So he put Robinson in those situations, but he misled Jackie Robinson at first. He had him think that he was going to create a black major leagues team, which wasn't actually the case. And then he eventually told Robinson the truth. Robinson originally joined a minor league called the Montreal Royal, and then he eventually joined the major leagues, the Dodgers. There were some rumors of a broken contract, but that Robinson had with a previous team, but those were false. The second research source, Robinson as a Dodger in 1947 to 1956. Robinson was a little bit older than some of the other rookies in baseball. He was 28, and he received, just as expected, a lot of insults, even death threats. But to the rest of the people, Robinson became a symbol of Black opportunity. And he even wrote a letter of gratitude to Branch Rickey that was published, thanking him for the opportunity that he gave him. It was mentioned that Branch Rickey had some different reasons for integrating baseball. Some of them conflicted with each other. It wasn't really clear. He never really gave one reason why. And after the Dodgers became integrated, naturally the other baseball teams followed. So the comparison between the primary and researched sources. So some of those similarities include the insults that were mentioned, how Branch Rickey and Jackie Robinson expected those insults, expected the death threats, unfortunately. They also both mentioned how many people were against it, which goes in hand with the insults. They both mentioned that Robinson needed to be more than just a good player. He needed to be a great player. He needed to be smart. He needed to be strong and represent his race. And then the differences between the primary and researched sources was the noble versus great. It wasn't, they both kind of not contradict each other, but noble implies that Rickey was doing that just for the credit of integrating baseball, whereas great makes it seem like Rickey came up with the idea all on his own. And so the two, the primary sources versus the research sources really differed in Rickey's portrayal. One made him seem like he was a hero, the other made it seem like he was just doing what he was doing. There was some discussion of other players of color joining Robinson, but the researched articles were much more detailed and focused more on Jackie Robinson exclusively. The first secondary article is called Background Article. So this article discussed how segregation based on race was immoral, and that larger crowds and a fan base with integration. So once they integrated the baseball teams, they expected that they would get a lot of people had a problem with it, but one of the concerns was that people wouldn't show up and people would stop supporting baseball. But this article mentioned how it would, if anything, bring people together and unite them with baseball. So one of the quotes was, "Just as Black soldiers showed their capability and bravery in fighting for their country during World War II, African Americans will also prove to be capable baseball players." There were a lot of people that really doubted that people of color would be as good as people that were white. And World War II really showed those people that that wasn't an accurate assumption to make, that people of color can be just as strong and just as brave as people that are white. But segregation was never really about the talent of who's going to be better, the black or the white players. It was really focused just in discrimination. The only reason why there was segregation is because of the discrimination. So it was never really about who was better. It was about keeping them separate. And they were supposed to be separate but equal, but as history has proven, that's never really been accurate. So there was no rule, formal or informal, against the integration, which worked out for Branch Rickey. And during the Holocaust, many American citizens really were against the discrimination of Jews in Germany, but turned a blind eye to the discrimination of Black people and all people of color in their own country. So the second secondary article, Nowatzki, Legitimate Black Heroes, talked about freedom and equality for all, but that was never really the case, just as separate but equal was also never the case. The segregation of organized baseball represents the injustice of American society. This goes hand in hand with baseball representing American society, because this is what people were really, really passionate about in the 40s and 50s. So once they were able to integrate the baseball teams, it helped integrate society in general and prepare for the civil rights movement, which came in the 60s. It was ironic that players of color were often compared to white players, saying, this player isn't as good as this white player, but it was never the other way around where, this white player wasn't as good as the black player. And another quote is, Maxon's lack of opportunity to play Major League Baseball symbolizes the marginalization of society as a whole, once again reinstating that baseball represented American society at this time. So the primary and researched sources versus the secondary sources. The secondary sources were much more about society in general rather than just one player. The primary and researched sources focus specifically on Jackie Robinson's story as well as Branch Rickey's story, whereas the secondary sources really were more detailed and pointed out the hypocritical perspectives of citizens, where people were really against the discrimination of Jews, but yet were very much in favor of the discrimination of people of color. Rickey's portrayal, in one article, he was portrayed as a critical role in the integration. That was mainly in the primary sources, but he wasn't really mentioned in the secondary sources, at least not as somebody who played a really big role. So while he did play a significant role, the primary sources definitely hinted that that he played a much bigger role than perhaps he did. The secondary sources really took a step back from how he was portrayed and focused more on why baseball was relevant with the societal integration and how baseball was a representation of society, and once they could integrate baseball, they could integrate society, which was very helpful. So my personal reflection, I found it really interesting how important baseball was to society's perspective. I wouldn't say that that's the case in modern day, especially with the internet and social media. I feel like there are definitely different priorities nowadays than there were back in the 40s and 50s. I expected to read a little bit more about the insults and the scrutiny. It was mentioned, it was definitely mentioned more than once, that Robinson was highly insulted and received death threats, but they didn't really give any specific examples or give details about it. So I thought they would have gone into that a little bit more. I also thought it was interesting that Rickey was portrayed more as a hero in one article, whereas in another article, it helped take a step back from the bias of the article. I thought that was interesting because when you read an article, you don't always see the bias of it originally. But then once you take a step back and read another article, you can see how one is a little bit more biased than the other. So yeah, that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.